The sound arrived before the bullets, a savage mechanical bark that split the jungle air like nothing the Japanese Marines had ever heard in training. Corporal Tanaka dropped to the mud instinctively, his breath catching in his throat. But the sound didn't stop. It kept hammering, a relentless percussive rhythm that seemed to come from everywhere at once, echoing off the trees and bouncing through the green cathedral of vegetation, until the entire world became noise. The bamboo beside him exploded into splinters, the thick stalks shredded as if invisible hands were tearing them apart from the inside, and in that instant he understood that something had fundamentally changed in the war he thought he knew. The Marines around him were screaming orders he couldn't hear over the roar, their mouths open, their eyes wide with an expression he had never seen on their faces before. Not in China, not in the Philippines, not even during the naval bombardments that turned beaches into moonscapes. This was different. This was personal. This was coming from one man. 3 weeks earlier, Tanaka's unit had received intelligence briefings about American infantry weapons. The sergeants had spoken with confidence about the enemy's bolt-action rifles, the same basic technology that had dominated warfare since before any of them were born. One shot, one reload, one target, one breath. The rhythm of individual riflemen engaging individual targets, the ancient dance of marksmen that Japanese doctrine understood perfectly. Their own Type 38 rifles were longer, lighter, designed for soldiers smaller in stature, but trained to perfection in the art of controlled fire and bayonet charges. The Americans, they were told, relied on superior numbers and artillery support, but man to man, rifle to rifle, the Imperial Japanese Marine Corps had proven itself superior in close combat from Manchuria to the Solomon Islands. The jungle, their instructors emphasized, belonged to those who could move silently, strike suddenly, and disappear like ghosts into the green maze where vehicles couldn't follow and air power couldn't see. In the dense vegetation of the Pacific Islands, where visibility extended only meters in any direction, the advantage would belong to discipline, to training, to the warrior spirit that had been honed over centuries of samurai tradition. The Americans, soft and mechanized, would find themselves lost and vulnerable in an environment where their industrial might meant nothing. But no one had prepared them for this. No one had explained that some Americans carried weapons that didn't follow the rules, that violated the understood rhythm of infantry combat, that transformed a single soldier into a sustained nightmare of fire and violence. The weapon Tanaka heard now, though he didn't yet know its name, was firing continuously, not in measured shots, but in a controlled stream of destruction that seemed to have no end. He pressed his face into the rotting vegetation, smelling the sweet decay of jungle floor, feeling the impacts vibrate through the earth beneath him, as rounds chewed into tree trunks and sent cascades of leaves spiraling down through shafts of sunlight. The sound was different from machine gun fire, which they had encountered before and learned to recognize. The German MG-42's buzzsaw scream, their own Type 92's slower methodical pulse. This was something in between, something more intimate and somehow more terrifying because it meant one man, not a crew, not a fixed position, but a single rifleman who could move and fire and move again without the constraints they had learned to expect. Private Sato, who had been advancing 3 meters to Tanaka's left, wasn't moving anymore. The young Marine lay sprawled across a fallen log, his rifle still clutched in his hands, his chest torn open by impacts that had come so fast they seemed simultaneous. Tanaka stared at the body, trying to process what he was seeing. Sato had been hit not once, but multiple times, the rounds striking in a tight cluster that spoke to accuracy combined with volume of fire. This wasn't suppression. This wasn't the wild spraying of a panicked soldier burning through ammunition. This was controlled, precise, and absolutely devastating. The weapon was cutting through cover that would have stopped rifle rounds, punching through palm trunks as thick as a man's thigh, sending splinters the size of chopsticks spinning through the air like shrapnel. The muzzle flash, when Tanaka dared to lift his head enough to look, appeared as a bright lance of fire through the green gloom, positioned perhaps 50 meters away but impossible to pinpoint because the sound seemed to originate from the jungle itself, as if the forest had grown angry and learned to shoot. Sergeant Yamada was yelling something about flanking, about maintaining formation, but his voice sounded thin and desperate beneath the mechanical roar that continued without pause. The squad had been trained to assault through enemy fire, to close the distance and engage with bayonets where Japanese discipline and ferocity would prevail. But how could you close distance against fire that never stopped? How could you time your movement to the gaps between shots when there were no gaps? Tanaka watched as Lance Corporal Ito attempted to rush forward, running in the low crouch they had practiced 10,000 times, and saw him stumble as if he had tripped over a root. But Ito hadn't tripped. The rounds had found him mid-stride, and he collapsed into the undergrowth without a sound, just another body swallowed by the green. The weapon kept firing. The American behind it, and it had to be one American, the angle of fire wasn't changing, the position was static, seemed to have infinite ammunition, infinite time, infinite patience to simply sit there and destroy everything that moved. The psychological impact was immediate and profound. These were not raw recruits, but veteran Marines who had survived the meat grinder of Guadalcanal, who had endured the hell of Tarawa where the coral ran red and the lagoon filled with bodies, who had been told by their officers that American soldiers were individually inferior, dependent on machines and firepower to compensate for their lack of warrior spirit. But machines required crews, required setup, required vulnerable positions that could be flanked and destroyed. This was different. This felt like fighting something that shouldn't exist, a hybrid that combined the firepower of a machine gun with the mobility and concealment of a rifleman. The sound alone was enough to stop men in their tracks, that relentless hammering that seemed to have a pulse, a rhythm that got inside your chest and disrupted your heartbeat until you couldn't tell where the gunfire ended and your own terror began. Tanaka tried to remember his training, tried to focus on breath and sight picture and all the mechanical actions that were supposed to override fear, but his hands were shaking as he gripped his rifle. The weapon felt inadequate suddenly, like a child's toy compared to what the Americans were wielding. His Type 38 held 5 rounds in the magazine, each shot requiring a deliberate pull of the bolt, each reload a series of practiced motions that now seemed impossibly slow and exposed. The American weapon, whatever it was, just kept firing, round after round flowing out in bursts that lasted 3, 4, 5 seconds before pausing just long enough for Tanaka to hope it was over, then starting again. The pauses weren't for reloading, he realized. They were for aiming. The American was selecting targets, engaging them with sustained fire until they stopped moving, then shifting to the next threat. It was methodical, it was efficient, it was absolutely terrifying. The squad was pinned, unable to advance, unable to effectively return fire because the moment anyone raised their head above the ferns and fallen logs, the weapon found them. Tanaka had seen machine gun fire before, had learned to time his movements to the traversing arc, had understood that machine guns fired in predictable patterns that could be read and exploited. But this was unpredictable. The Americans seemed to be firing from the shoulder, aiming each burst individually, responding to movement with a speed that suggested he wasn't operating a heavy weapon, but something more personal, more immediate. The rounds themselves hit with shocking force, not the crack of rifle bullets, but heavy impacts that sounded like hammers striking wood, like the weapon was throwing something bigger, something meaner than the 6.5mm rounds their own rifles fired. When they hit flesh, the results were catastrophic. When they hit trees, chunks of bark and wood exploded outward in clouds of debris that stung exposed skin and filled the air with the smell of fresh sap. Somewhere to the right, another Marine screamed. The sound was cut short, replaced by the wet thud of a body hitting earth. The American was working through them systematically, and Tanaka realized with a cold clarity that they were going to die here, in this nameless patch of jungle on an island whose name he could barely pronounce, killed by a weapon they hadn't known existed by an enemy they had been taught to despise as inferior. The irony would have been funny if terror hadn't squeezed his chest so tight he could barely breathe. He looked at Yamada, saw the sergeant's face pale beneath the tan, saw the recognition in the older man's eyes that their tactics were useless against this kind of firepower. Japanese doctrine emphasized spiritual strength, emphasized will over material, emphasized the power of the offensive spirit to overcome any obstacle. But spirit couldn't dodge bullets that came too fast to count. Will couldn't stop rounds that punched through cover like it wasn't there. The offensive spirit meant nothing when you couldn't get close enough to use it. The firing stopped. The silence that followed was somehow worse than the noise, a ringing emptiness that felt pregnant with danger. Tanaka's ears were still processing the echoes, his brain still flinching from impacts that were no longer coming. Was the American reloading, moving, calling for support, or simply waiting for one of them to make a mistake, to expose themselves in the mistaken belief that the threat had passed? Tanaka pressed himself flatter into the mud, trying to become invisible, trying to blend with the rotting logs and decomposing leaves, wishing he could sink into the earth itself and disappear. His breathing sounded impossibly loud in his own ears, each exhale a betrayal that might give away his position. The jungle around them had gone quiet too, the birds and insects silenced by the violence, as if nature itself was holding its breath. Then Yamada made his decision. The sergeant rose from cover in a sudden rush, his rifle raised, his voice forming the beginning of a battle cry that had terrified enemies across Asia. The American weapon spoke again before the cry could fully form, and Yamada was thrown backward as if yanked by invisible wires, his rifle spinning away, his body crumpling into the ferns with a finality that needed no confirmation. Tanaka watched it happen, saw the muzzle flash through the undergrowth, saw the way the sergeant's body jerked under multiple impacts, saw the absolute futility of courage against firepower. The message was clear. Heroism was suicide. Aggression was death. Every principle they had been taught, every tenet of their training, was worse than useless here. It was a guarantee of destruction. The weapon kept firing, now targeting the position where Yamada had been concealed, tearing apart the vegetation as if to make a point, to demonstrate that there was nowhere to hide, no cover solid enough to provide safety. Tanaka heard someone sobbing, realized it might be him, tried to force his breathing under control before hyperventilation made him pass out. How many of them were left? 6? 5? He had lost count, lost track of who had fallen and who was still breathing. The patrol that had left the company position that morning with 12 men, confident and ready to hunt American stragglers, had been reduced to terrified survivors in a matter of minutes by what sounded like a single enemy soldier with a weapon that shouldn't exist. And then Tanaka heard something that made his blood freeze, the sound of another weapon joining the first. Same distinctive bark, same relentless rhythm, but from a different position, perhaps 30 meters from the original shooter. The Americans had more than one. Of course they did. Why would they give such a weapon to only one man? The crossfire was immediate and inescapable, the two guns working in coordination to create a web of fire that covered every possible avenue of movement, every potential covered approach, every desperate attempt to flee. The jungle that had seemed like an ally, like protective cover that would shelter them from American firepower, had become a cage. The dense vegetation that blocked lines of sight worked both ways, preventing them from seeing where the fire was coming from, making it impossible to coordinate a response or identify targets. They were fighting blind against an enemy who seemed to know exactly where they were. The second weapon focused on their flank, systematically destroying the positions where the remaining Marines had taken cover. Tanaka heard the distinctive sound of rounds hitting flesh, heard the abbreviated gasps and gurgles that marked the end of lives, heard the weapon shift fire with mechanical precision to the next position. It was like being hunted by something that could see through the jungle, that could sense movement and heat and fear. His rational mind knew it was simply experienced infantry using superior firepower, but his lizard brain, The ancient part that existed only to assess threats and ensure survival was screaming that this was impossible, that no human could fire that many rounds that accurately, that quickly. It felt supernatural, like facing demons made of gunpowder and steel. The first weapon had gone silent again, but Tanaka understood now that silence meant nothing. It meant reloading or repositioning, or simply waiting for targets to expose themselves. The second weapon was still hammering, still tearing through the jungle with the same terrifying consistency. How much ammunition did they have? Japanese doctrine emphasized conservation, rationing shots, making every round count because resupply was difficult and uncertain. But the Americans seemed to have no such concerns, pouring fire into suspected positions with a profligacy that spoke to logistics and supply lines that Japanese forces could only dream about. It wasn't just the weapons that were different, it was the entire philosophy of war. Where Japanese soldiers were taught to endure hardship and overcome through spiritual strength, American soldiers apparently just brought enough bullets to solve any problem through sheer volume of fire. Tanaka knew he had to move. Staying here meant dying when the Americans either flanked the position or called in artillery, or simply continued to methodically destroy every piece of cover. But moving meant exposing himself to those terrible weapons, meant becoming a target for fire that came too fast to dodge and hit too hard to survive. He was paralyzed by the choice, frozen by the recognition that both options led to death. This was how wars were really won, he realized, not through superior courage or training or spirit, but through creating situations where the enemy had no good options, where every choice led to destruction. The Americans had created that situation with just 2 weapons and probably 2 men. How many more of these weapons were out there? How many more Americans carried them? The entire tactical picture that Japanese commanders had painted, the assumptions about American infantry capabilities, suddenly seemed dangerously obsolete. A rustling sound came from his left, and Tanaka turned his head slowly to see Private Oshiro crawling backward, trying to extract himself from the kill zone. The young Marine's eyes were wide with panic, his movements jerky and desperate. Tanaka wanted to call out, to warn him that movement would draw fire, but before he could make a sound, the first weapon spoke again. Oshiro's back arched, his mouth opened in a silent scream, and he collapsed, face first, into the mud. The shooting stopped. The silence returned. Tanaka counted his heartbeats, counted his breaths, tried to estimate how many men were still alive, but he couldn't see anyone, couldn't hear anything except the drip of water from leaves and the distant call of a bird that apparently hadn't learned that this part of the jungle was now a graveyard. Minutes passed like hours. The Americans weren't advancing, weren't calling out for surrender, weren't doing anything except maintaining their positions and waiting. It was a kind of psychological warfare that Tanaka had never encountered, more effective than any banzai charge or suicidal defense. They were letting fear do the work, letting the survivors marinate in terror, while wondering if every breath would be their last. And it was working. Tanaka could feel his mind starting to fracture, starting to imagine sounds and movement that weren't there, starting to consider options that would have been unthinkable that morning. Surrender, desertion, suicide, anything to make the waiting end, to resolve the terrible uncertainty of not knowing when the next burst would come or who it would find. Then he heard American voices, low and conversational, speaking a language he didn't understand, but could interpret through tone alone. They were relaxed, casual, discussing something with the ease of men who felt completely in control of the situation. One of them laughed, actually laughed, and Tanaka felt rage flash through the fear. How dare they? How dare they treat this like a casual afternoon's work? But beneath the anger was a deeper recognition. They could afford to laugh because they held every advantage, because their weapons had turned what should have been a roughly even firefight into a massacre, because they knew that the terrified Marines hiding in the undergrowth posed no real threat to men armed with such devastating firepower. The voices moved, circling around the kill zone, and Tanaka understood they were clearing the area, checking bodies, ensuring no threats remained. He had seconds to decide. He could try to fight, to sell his life expensively, to uphold the code that said capture was dishonor and death was preferable to surrender. Or he could try to survive, to escape back to the company position and report what he had learned, to warn others about these weapons that changed everything. His hand moved to the grenade on his belt, felt its solid weight, imagined pulling the pin and rushing the American voices. But the image that came to mind was Yamada, torn apart mid-charge, his courage meaningless against the mechanical precision of sustained automatic fire. Heroism was suicide. He understood that now. So Tanaka did something he had never imagined doing. He slowly, carefully removed his equipment, his pack, his rifle, everything that might make noise or catch on vegetation. He took a long breath, pressed himself into the mud until he was coated in it, and began to crawl backward with the slowness of growth, with the patience of erosion, moving only when the American voices were talking, freezing when they went quiet, becoming nothing more than another piece of jungle debris. It took an eternity. His muscles screamed. His nerves sang with tension. Every sound seemed amplified. Every movement felt like it was being broadcast to the enemy. But the Americans didn't fire, didn't call out, didn't give any indication they had seen him. Maybe they assumed everyone was dead. Maybe they simply didn't care about one more corpse in the jungle. Whatever the reason, Tanaka kept crawling, kept moving, kept putting distance between himself and that terrible place until the voices faded and the jungle closed around him like protective darkness. He crawled for what must have been 100 meters before he dared to rise to his feet, and even then he moved in a crouch ready to drop at any sound. His body was shaking uncontrollably, adrenaline flooding his system with nowhere to go, manifesting as tremors that made it difficult to navigate through the undergrowth. He had no equipment, no weapon, no way to defend himself, but none of that mattered, because all he could think about was getting away, putting distance between himself and those weapons that had destroyed his entire patrol in minutes. The sound of that distinctive bark would haunt him, he knew, would wake him gasping in the night, would make him flinch at unexpected noises for however long he survived this war. When he finally stumbled into the company perimeter 2 hours later, the sentries almost shot him before recognizing what remained of his uniform beneath the coating of mud and blood. The company commander listened to his report with a face that cycled through disbelief, anger, and finally a grim acceptance. Tanaka tried to explain what he had experienced, tried to describe the weapons that had destroyed them, but the words felt inadequate. How could language capture the reality of that sustained fire, that terrible mechanical rhythm, that sense of complete helplessness in the face of superior firepower? The commander asked questions. How many Americans? What kind of weapon? What was the rate of fire? But Tanaka's answers were fragmented, disconnected, colored by the trauma of watching his entire squad die around him. Other survivors began trickling in over the next few hours. Private Nakamura, who had been on the far right flank and managed to escape when the Americans concentrated on the center. Lance Corporal Fujita, who had played dead beneath 2 corpses and waited until nightfall to move. Each told the same story, described the same weapon, expressed the same shock and terror. Out of 12 Marines, only 4 survived. The others lay somewhere in that jungle, torn apart by a weapon they hadn't known existed, killed by a tactical reality that their training hadn't prepared them for. The company commander sent runners to battalion requesting intelligence about American automatic weapons, requesting information that might help them understand what they had faced. The response that came back was fragmentary and unhelpful. Yes, the Americans had some kind of automatic rifle. No, there wasn't much information about its capabilities. Yes, it seemed to be relatively common among their infantry. The word spread through the Japanese positions like a disease, carried by survivors and amplified by fear. The Americans had a weapon, they said, that could fire like a machine gun but move like a rifle, that could cut through cover like paper, that could destroy entire squads in seconds. Some dismissed it as exaggeration, as the natural tendency of defeated soldiers to inflate the strength of their enemies to excuse their failure. But too many independent reports described the same thing, the same distinctive sound, the same devastating effectiveness. Patrols that would have advanced confidently into the jungle began hesitating, began asking for heavy weapon support, began requesting intelligence about American positions before committing to movement. The psychological impact rippled outward, affecting not just those who had encountered the weapon, but everyone who heard about it, everyone who began to wonder if the next time they saw an American rifleman, he might be carrying one of those terrible guns. Japanese commanders began adapting their tactics, emphasizing longer engagement ranges where the American weapons' advantages would be reduced, avoiding the close-quarters jungle fighting where sustained automatic fire could dominate. But the jungle didn't allow for long ranges, didn't provide clear fields of fire, didn't accommodate the new caution that was creeping into Japanese operations. The islands were small, the vegetation dense, and close combat was inevitable, which meant encountering those weapons was inevitable, which meant accepting casualties from an enemy whose individual soldiers were now more dangerous than Japanese doctrine had ever anticipated. The reports that went up the chain of command spoke of American automatic rifles in clinical terms, noting technical specifications and estimated capabilities. But the reports couldn't capture the true impact, the way those weapons got inside men's heads, the way the memory of that distinctive bark could make veteran Marines hesitate before advancing, the way confidence had been replaced by caution and caution by fear. Tanaka never went on patrol again. He didn't refuse orders. He simply developed a tremor in his hands that made it impossible to hold a rifle steady, a psychosomatic response that even the strictest discipline couldn't overcome. The company surgeon examined him, found nothing physically wrong, and declared him fit for duty. But Tanaka's body knew better, had internalized the lesson of that jungle firefight so deeply that it manifested as a physical inability to fight. He was eventually transferred to a supply unit, where he spent the rest of the war handling ammunition and rations, always far from the front lines, always safe from the sound that had broken something fundamental inside him. On quiet nights, when the tropical rain drummed on corrugated metal roofs and the darkness pressed close, he would hear it again in his memory, that relentless mechanical bark, that rhythm of death, that sound of American power translated into sustained automatic fire that had taught him the difference between what his instructors had promised and what war really was. Years after the war ended, when Tanaka was an old man running a small shop in Osaka, he would occasionally see Western tourists carrying what looked like fishing rod cases. And for just a moment, before his rational mind could intervene, his body would react, pulse quickening, breathing shallowing, hands beginning to shake. Because his nervous system remembered what his conscious mind tried to forget, that there existed weapons which could reduce courage to irrelevance, training to futility, and an entire squad of Imperial Japanese Marines to corpses in the jungle, all in the space of a few terrible minutes. The weapon had a name, he learned eventually, Browning Automatic Rifle, but names meant nothing. What mattered was the sound, the impact, the way it had rewritten the rules of infantry combat and left survivors like him to carry the memory of its power for the rest of their lives. In his nightmares, which never fully stopped, he was always back in that jungle, always hearing that distinctive bark, always crawling through mud while his squad mates died around him, and always, beneath the fear and the trauma, there was a bitter recognition of the truth that no amount of warrior spirit or training or discipline could overcome the simple mathematics of superior firepower, deployed with brutal efficiency. The Americans had understood something that Japanese doctrine had refused to accept, that in modern war the soldier with the better weapon would usually win, regardless of who had the stronger spirit. It was a lesson learned in blood and terror, a lesson that couldn't be unlearned, a lesson that echoed in the sound of rain on metal roofs and the sudden bark of engines backfiring, and any unexpected noise that carried even the faintest echo of that jungle afternoon, when automatic fire had taught him the final, absolute limits of courage.